Alright, so as soon as we heard about the passing of Charles Grodin, we thought that we had to talk about it or address it in some way. And of course, he's like this really big comedy legend. But like even like obviously he has movies like he had some Neil Simon comedies and The Heartbreak Kid and stuff like that. But there and then like various like TV appearances. He had his own talk show at one point, and then like really late in his career, he had some really great appearances on Louie. And it just spans like decades. And like the earliest I remember seeing him though is in the very creepy role of Dr. Hill in Rosemary's Baby. He's the doctor that sells Rosemary down the river to the Satanists.
Oh man.
But yeah, mainly he was a comedy legend, and of course, the first thing a lot of people talked about was Midnight Run, which my immediate thought was I need to talk about Midnight Run because I haven't yet. And I was trying to think of like a versus thing to go with it, but I can't really think of one, so I'll probably just do Midnight Run like by itself. Just make a video devoted to talking about Midnight Run. Probably in this lineup of videos you'll be getting all at once. But there's something else that everybody pretty much thinks of when they think of Charles Grodin, specifically people like us that grew up on a couple of certain movies. And I love that despite his entire legendary career, all the headlines I saw in the articles announcing his death were the same picture, and that was the picture of him in bed with Beethoven. So yeah, like most people my age, there are these two movies. We are ignoring the third one with Judge Reinhold and I don't know how fucking many of them there were. There were a lot of direct-to-video sequels, but yeah, it was one of those cases of I only knew him as George Newton, and then it was throughout life. It was like, oh, this guy was like a comedy legend, and had been quite a bit before this. I had never, because there was a while there where he seemed to disappear, and then he started making appearances every now and then. He was in While We're Young, I think it was called, one of Noah Baumbach's movies with Ben Stiller, and it was clear how much he had aged. And that was when I looked it up, and I realized, and I think a lot of people didn't realize this, was when he made the Beethoven movies, he was already in like his 50s, but you can't tell. It's like we were just reading in the trivia about how they talk about how he and Bonnie Hunt in the movie supposedly went to school together, and they were like high school sweethearts. And he's like much older than her.
30 years.
But you can't tell. You really can't. And that's not saying Bonnie Hunt looks old. I'm saying Grodin apparently did not age for a long time.
He also has a really good appearance in Law and Order SVU, where he plays like the head of a school where like teachers are diddling kids, and he like sweeps it under the rug.
So he kind of went back to his creepy Rosemary's Baby roots a little bit. Because that's all of Rosemary's Baby is sweeping stuff under the rug.
And it was one of those cases where, like, when I saw that episode and he popped up, like, he elicited the response of me literally pointing at my TV and going, Charles Grodin!
What era would this have been? Like, what decade would this have been in?
I don't remember. I think it's a Maloney episode, but I'm not sure.
So, I figure we'll just, like, this will probably be under the Versus label, but I didn't really plan on doing the Versus thing much.
Yeah.
It's really just talking about, it's just celebrating Charles Grodin, and it's like, we'll do these, and then I'll talk about Midnight Run and stuff like that. But, so should we just go, let's just go into the first one, and then we'll go into the second one, and that'll just be what this video is, and we'll just celebrate these movies, I guess. And because I'm going to be totally honest with you, until I rewatch, like, there are those movies in your childhood that you watch a shitload, to the point that, like, even to this day, I know, like, every beat of the first movie. Really the second one, too, because we just watched them so many times. But then at some point, usually, the movies like this, like, don't age well. You watch it back and you're like, oh, wow, this is, like, actually shit. Especially since it falls under such a trope of the whole... The dad doesn't want the dog, and the dog wreaks havoc, and we talked about Turner and Hooch like a couple of months ago or something, and there was like a whole trope set in there, and you would think that would like age it poorly, but I've watched, in the past 2 or 3 years, I've rewatched Beethoven twice, And both times I went back to it, it was like, I, I think it's kind of legit good. Like, the plot is so dark. Like, I don't think like, when I was a kid, I don't think I ever picked up on the plot. Because when I rewatched it back, like, a couple of years ago, that was the first time I really noticed what the plot was. What Dean Jones was doing exactly. And it was like, holy shit. It's like, that's what he's doing.
There's also, let's not forget, there's another trope going on with these movies. And the trope is Charles Grodin is pissed off.
Yeah, I didn't mention Clifford at the start of this. Which is funny because Martin Short was one of like a billion options to have played George. We mentioned Hanks was apparently one. Just pretty much everybody in that era you would think of. Ed O'Neill, Ron Williams, Goodman,
Rick Moranis.
Yeah, like everybody you were reading off there made sense. I can't imagine Rick Moranis super angry. I think he would have just like. There are moments in the first movie, especially, where George Newton just absolutely looks like a broken man. It's like I could see Rick Moranis playing that well. Like just everything that could go wrong goes wrong, and sometimes it doesn't even have anything to do with Beethoven. It's just this man's life is at a complete dead end, and you can see his soul breaking every time he gets. It's specifically him getting wet all the time.
I think they found the perfect person to do it because just Charles Grodin's deadpan delivery of things just works so well.
Yeah, you would almost think it's like this is like an actor taking a paycheck and it's somebody who's not getting to utilize their talents as well. This kind of perfectly utilizes what Grodin's sense of humor was. I didn't even mention also at the beginning his Letterman interviews, where he and Letterman had like a pretend rivalry. It was amazing.
I think it's come to be known as the grumpy guest routine.
Yeah. So when we start the movie, we actually start the movie more or less with Stanley Tucci and Oliver Platt, two actors that we would continue to see and still continue to see quite often in our lives, and it always comes back to this movie. They even did a movie together, The Imposters, that I believe Tucci directed as well, and the whole time I was watching The Imposters, it never even occurred to me, the reunion. And what's interesting about this movie is it came out in 1991, so it's right after Home Alone, and as you know, like, after Home Alone came out, everybody wanted to be Home Alone. Like, everybody was trying to be Home Alone, and I guess you could say maybe they were trying to do a Harry and Marv thing with them a little bit. But even before we got the actual live-action 101 Dalmatians, I feel like they were actually a live-action Jasper and Horace. They're even trying to steal dogs. I mean, is anybody else getting that vibe? There's how do you describe Stanley Tucci? He's like hyperactive, maybe. And he's
very over the top.
Yeah, and he's very sort of aggressive, yet also just as dumb as his counterpart. And then you've got like the sort of like more heavyset one, like Horace. Which is really funny since we literally just had our second dose of an actual live-action Jasper and Horace. And throughout Cruella, I was mostly thinking like, man, they remind me of Tucci and Oliver Platt a little bit. Just they're actually kind of smarter in Cruella, but we don't want to get on that whole thing. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to address as far as they're concerned. And then we were talking about other tropes that I pretty much associate specifically with this movie that you still hear about today.
Wait a minute. Before you move on, it's funny that you made the Jasper and Horace connection, and the main person that they work for is known for being in Disney films.
Yeah. There's so many things here where I'm starting to wonder if anything's an accident. Yes, I definitely want to talk about Dean Jones at length as well. But as far as like the Newton family, there's a lot of tropes we were talking about before, like the whole dog and the angry dad and all that. But then there's just stuff like the idea of families having a full-on breakfast every single morning, even though everybody's rushing out the door. It looks an awful lot like a school morning, even though Ted says it's a Saturday. But George is still running out the door to go to work. And we get that great routine when he gets his pants drooled on, and he goes through the whole thing about how he's going to have to change every single layer of clothing. Only to be pulling out of the driveway with his window down, and Bonnie Hunt turns to say goodbye to him while she's holding the hose. And he gets wet again, and once again, not even Beethoven's fault. And you can just see how much this man hates his life. But what's interesting is a lot of the dramatic beats in the movie come from how much he hates his life. Because there's one good thing he's got in his life right now, at least in his mindset right now. The Duchovny, Patricia Heaton thing that's going on. His business. These people, we were having the discussion of imagine it's the same character played by Duchovny, and it's like, is this before or after Don't Tell Him the Babysitter's Dead? Which we have to come up with ourselves because they came out the same year. Yeah, before we even get really deep into the Dean Jones plot, we already have characters that desperately need a comeuppance, and they get it. Like, I'd forgotten just how, like, kind of evil they are, because they're so... I mean, it's clear on the surface they're absolute... Do you want to pick a word here?
Fools.
Okay.
Fools comes to mind.
And, like, they're insulting the kids, and there's that weird moment. Like, I know it's just to show off how much he's a douchebag, but it really weirds me out. The scene when he asks Bonnie Hunt for more lemonade. There's just something about that makes my skin crawl.
Not to mention the fact that you can tell that they're kind of angling to take George's company and kick him out of it.
Yeah, that's a part, like, growing up that I never caught. Like, I thought the big come-up was just from the fact that they were douchebags. Because they really just kind of slip that in. It's like, we're going to take his whole company. It's actually kind of suspenseful, waiting to see if he's going to sign it or not, and things keep cutting him off.
Beethoven figured it out.
Yeah. Beethoven has a knack for figuring everything out in this movie.
I think it's, if you look at his eyes, they're red throughout most of the movie, so I think he's, like, on that other plane where, like, you're so high, you start analyzing everything.
We had a great discussion about this while we were watching. We literally just rewatched both of them, like, right before we turned the camera on. That whole scene where he goes around town, which is actually great because it's like, nowadays, it seems like you can't get an animal movie or a dog movie or anything like that without the animals talking. It's like, it kind of feels like a nice throwback to watch a movie where a dog just walks around for a long time with no dialogue. And just watch the shit that he does. One of the things we were discussing, I don't know how St. Bernards work exactly, but we were discussing, like, can he ingest all that he ingests in this one scene?
He's pretty much a garbage disposal.
Because he has ice cream, he has, what was that, like a donut? He has a Twinkie when he meets up with Rice at school, and then he goes home and takes a cookie. That's a big-ass cookie. It's like, how is this dog alive? Like I said, maybe St. Bernards work differently internally, I have no idea. But the only other basis I have for St. Bernards is Cujo. Which kind of felt like we were kind of headed in that direction sometimes, especially with the eyes. Like, I get the idea that the school bullies might have seen Cujo. Because it came out in '83. You know, they could have caught it by now. One of the kids being the kid from Rookie of the Year, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt from behind. You don't actually, like, see his face. He's just running onto the bus. But he still gets a credit in the credit roll. But, is there anything you want to single out? Because I'm gonna head in that Dean Jones direction in a minute.
Go ahead and head in the Dean Jones direction.
Okay, so we were talking before about villains that are played by actors that are actors that you don't see coming. And this is the case of I only grew up with, like, certain Disney movies, like the live-action Disney movies specifically, so there were a lot that I only discovered later. So when I was growing up, Dean Jones was only Dr. Varnick. And it was, and I, like, if you would have asked me, I would have assumed that was his real voice. I would have assumed he was a guy that played villains for a living. And as it turns out, in a big twist, to me, this is the weird part in his filmography. This is the part that kind of came from out of nowhere. Because he was in a lot of the live-action Disney movies playing the protagonist, basically. He was the George Newton of those movies. So it's like an intentional sort of left turn in casting that this is the kind of part that he plays in this. And he's not just playing a villain in a kid's movie. Dr. Varnick is a fucking bad guy. He's a really, really bad guy. There is that one scene in particular that he's not even in. And it's when Tucci and Platt are getting rid of the evidence. And they're throwing boxes into an incinerator. And Tucci implies the puppies are next. Because he said get rid of all the evidence. By the way, Tucci has no problem with this. And obviously Varnick doesn't because it's his plan. And I was trying to remember, or really trying to think, like, even if it's, the editing just implies it, but we obviously know what's happening. Can you imagine a movie geared specifically towards kids today coming out? Now, of all the bad shit that's implied in this, let's talk about this for a second. The plot of the movie, if you don't remember, is basically Dr. Varnick has been hired to get a dog whose skull is big enough and strong enough to test the strength of ammunition at close range. That's the fucking plot.
Not to mention that his day job is that he's a veterinarian.
Yeah, and I just had an epiphany when we were watching it just now. Because I'm so familiar with the movie now and the fact that he's a vet and all that I never really picked up on the fact that it's a dramatic reveal that he's a vet. Because we only see the shady side of him for the first couple of scenes he's in. And then it's revealed, oh, by the way, he's a vet. And he, like, runs this place. And it's like this whole twisted... It's like it brings a twisted underworld to the veterinarian world. Like, what were you reading about, like, an angry letter being sent to the NBA?
From the Veterinary Association. Because they had chosen a veterinarian to play this role. Or not play the role, but as the character is a veterinarian.
Play that role in the story.
Yeah.
Oh, and another thing I was going to bring up was the idea of everything that's implied in this. Honestly, with all that other bad shit, just to take one scene by itself, I can't imagine a movie geared specifically towards kids today having a scene where it's implied that the dog is getting, like, beat in the face to get provoked. Like, that's... like, when when I realized that just now watching it back, on this... You have, like, a 70-inch TV, by the way. This is like the biggest Beethoven's ever been. The close-ups in this are amazing when you see it. But, especially on Grodin.
We should have gone back to the first one. I should have put the TV picture on Zoom for those, too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we're having a lot of fun with the second movie, and but we'll get to that. But no, when I was watching it back, and it's like I know what happens, because I've seen this a million. Like I said, I know every beat of this movie. Like I could not watch this movie again for another 20 years. But if I were to watch it again 20 years from now with not having watched it in that span of that 20 years, I would still know every beat of this movie because it's just in there forever now because of childhood. I felt a little bit of a shock in that edit when, like, his hand comes down and it cuts to Emily in shock. It's like, that really shows him hitting Beethoven without showing it. And the implied attack, like, even though we see him applying the blood, still it's like kind of intense. And it's even more intense when we get the point of view shot from Beethoven as he's growling, like he's saying, help me for the act, and then he's growling good boy under his breath. It's insane. This character's this fucking rocker, but he's so knows exactly what his plan is and knows exactly how to lay it out.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's wild. This movie's wild. This movie's plot is wild. Like, you can say even the ending
Mm-hmm.
feels like such a dark end. Like, you can have, Ted is driving the car and Ted drives through the building, wacky family antics. Even with that in there, it's still dark.
That's and let's not forget that because they give him extra money to get a bigger dog to do it because he mentions that they're hard to come by, and it's not like he sees Beethoven and then he goes home and thinks on it, and there's a scene where like they put more pressure on him to find a big dog and then he like resorts to it. No, as soon as he meets Beethoven, he knows exactly what he's doing next.
Yeah, he like immediately says, "Mr. Doom, can I talk to you in private, maybe?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's like
he starts the frame up almost immediately.
it's like, honestly, you have to commend him because he's that good that he could just pull it off in the moment like that and know exactly what his plan was.
And it makes you wonder how many of the other dogs that they have did he get that way?
Yeah. Yeah, because obviously there's a whole thing like already going on.
Well, they say at the end when they talk about his court case, he was indicted on 123 counts of animal abuse.
Yeah, and that's not it. That's not even like what we see is there even a fraction of that?
I don't think so.
I mean, there is like a whole angry mob chasing Tucci and Platt at the end, but it's
but I would say there's no more than 20 dogs there.
Yeah, and it's like, are they even in that number?
Mm-hmm.
Or are these the ones that have passed already?
Mm-hmm.
Literally. It's like
I want to know how they found out about the other animals because they threw all the evidence in the incinerator. So I'm wondering if like maybe Platt and Tucci like tried to cut a deal.
yeah, that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that's probably exactly what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And then I didn't even think about this. You were asking me if the secretary was in on it.
Yeah.
Because she knew that the guy wouldn't be in, but it's like, that's some pretty expert planning if he was like setting that up specifically to where the lethal injection guy wasn't in.
Like, would the lethal injection guy have come in the next day and been like, "Where's all the dogs?"
It's like, am I fired? Like, am I being laid off? It's there's a much more effective method now than the lethal injections apparently,
Mm-hmm.
and it was almost used on George himself. It never occurred to me growing up that Beethoven's the kind of movie that almost had murders in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were talking about just the way some scenes play out, like going back to like the comedy aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like there's scenes that you watch in like thrillers. Not that we're going that route, but I mean just like the way tension is set up to where we're building to something. And you see like one thing happening and then another thing, and eventually these things are cut back and forth to until they collide. Like, that's the tension method.
Mm-hmm.
This is the method used for the Beethoven's in the beds.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's so much quiet. Like, he comes in, he turns on the Wolfman, he has to get out of bed and see what's down here. And it's like, because there's no... Like, movies now, and even movies back then too, really, any movie like this light, would use like a light kind of score.
Like something whimsical.
Yeah. There's dead silence when these things are colliding to make it to where he's in bed with Beethoven and thinks it's funny.
Half that scene is just the score from the Wolfman.
Yes. Like, what's that say? There's almost an eerie quality to it. Because then there's the whole thing where... Yeah, because, like, the whole score, like, the score that's actually in it, that's not, like, big and evil whenever...
Mm-hmm.
Like we were saying, when they answer the front door and Dr. Varnick's there, it's, like, jump scare score. But then, yeah, that score at the beginning, when Beethoven's, like, walking around the neighborhood, is the kind of score that they actually use that piece of score now in, like, animated trailers.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got the other side of that score. We were saying the same thing about Kindergarten Cop's score. I think it's the same composer. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And yet the tones kind of make sense too. Because when we did Kindergarten Cop and Turner and Hooch as a versus, we were talking about how, like, kids' movies don't have those dark plots like they used to in, like, the late 80s and early 90s. Mm-hmm. We totally could have included this.
Yeah.
And then we were talking about just how funny it is that the way Grodin's able to play it so straight. Because obviously he's there to kind of be the human punchline. Mm-hmm. Like we were talking about, like, his whole purpose throughout the movie is to get wet and be really upset about it, whether it be the sprinklers or the scene, the really famous scene where Beethoven's on the bed covered in God knows what, and he shakes off and he gets absolutely drenched. You know, George didn't have to stand there and take that. He could have left the room. The door was he was in the doorway. He could have backed out. But no, George took one for the team for the sake of comedy. But yes. Oh, let's go back to the darkness for a second, because there was something I literally only noticed this time around, and I never noticed it before. At the end, when everything's coming together, and they're all showing up at this place, this sinister place, whatever it is.
It's like a warehouse.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys ever noticed, or if anybody ever noticed before. Did you ever notice it before I pointed it out just now? Stanley Tucci walks into this room to talk to Dr. Varnick and get, like, instructions or whatever. He's holding 2 jars under his arms. What did we determine might have been in those jars?
Dog fetuses.
Yeah, something fucked up is in those jars, because they're see-through. We're looking right at whatever's in there, and it doesn't look pleasant, and it looks dog-related. And it's like, what the fuck is going on? It's like, are they being, like, artificially birthed and bred to be murdered? Is this what's happening?
Or were these dogs already murdered and they were, like, put in these jars for studying?
Oh, God. I was going to say...
Because they do test not only the ammunition, but they're testing chemicals, too.
Yeah.
Because they test the chemicals on the small dogs.
Jesus. What the fuck is this movie, and why did we never notice as kids? But that's amazing. I love that.
But let's point out, too, that you drew some comparisons to Kindergarten Cop, and one of the producers on this movie is Ivan Reitman.
Yep. Which makes perfect sense. It's all coming together. How did I not notice this? It's like, that's like when we were watching, I was like, how did I never notice that the shitty babysitter is Eliza from Hook? Because, of course, it's so clearly Eliza from Hook.
Yeah.
And it's like I think we watched Hook even more than we watched this, and that's saying something.
So basically what you learn is do not leave your kids at her house.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about, like, the whole idea is, you know, our whole family has changed since Beethoven. And it's like, you don't really realize till you think about it how serious that is. If they didn't have Beethoven, Emily would have drowned in the pool and died. Died. That would have been the only outcome. And then, because Ted and Rice only went out when they saw her, like, sitting on the step. And it's like, they didn't see anything else. And they wouldn't have seen anything else. It would have been over. Then we've got Ted and the bullies. And it's like, Ted had just gotten the best of those bullies. We talked about how, like, it's actually kind of impressive how he managed to get his glasses back before he ran away. And it's like, when you outsmart the bullies, then they're ready to kill you. And it's like, they were really determined to chase him. It's like, they were probably about to beat the holy shit out of him. And they, who knows what kind of damage they would have done. As we said, I mean, as likable as Ted is, he's also absolutely 100% a bully magnet. Like, that's... I was like, in the nice scene where it's like, they want to convince George to keep Beethoven, so they make him breakfast. And, like, as soon as I saw Ted in that suit, I was like, if the bullies could fucking see that, he'd be dead. And then, Rice seems to have had it the easiest, which is simply, he got her a boyfriend. He played matchmaker. But it's like she was...
It didn't last to the sequel.
And it's like, he played matchmaker, like, even more than once in the movie, didn't he? Yeah, because he called at the end because he saw her on TV. So...
Not to mention the fact George would have lost his company to David Duchovny and Patricia Heaton.
Yep.
And How many more murderers would Dr. Varnick have gotten away with?
Oh man, that business would still be going on now.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was pretty under. Like the only way he really slipped up was not having the fake bandage on when they showed up, but that's only because he wasn't expecting them.
Mm-hmm.
It was a pop in. It wasn't.
They popped in on him like he did them.
Yeah. Oh man, so much came back to bite him, literally. So and we were also talking about the way like he plants seeds.
Mm-hmm.
Like how when you were talking about how when he like first comes in and he's like, yeah, that's that's the dog. That's what I want.
Mm-hmm.
And like when he says, he brings George into the office and he's like, don't want to alarm anybody. Just telling you, St. Bernards can snap. Bye. This will not be important later at all. I promise you. Like I love when he's when he realizes he's been caught by Emily when he hit him. It's like the way he's even trying to get out of it as he's playing the victim and he's bleeding everywhere. And he's like, oh, the child must have thought she saw it. Like I just patted him on the head. She must have thought she saw something. He's like trying to gaslight them while he's doing this whole routine.
The child, of course, would defend the dog.
Yeah. By the way, another speech that was probably planned. He probably had it in his head just in case there's a witness. I can't pop them right away. I mean, this is a guy that would do that. Like when she said that's not true, you hit Beethoven. The way he looks at her is like witnesses must be silenced. Stitches get stitches. But yes. So, is there anything else? Oh yeah. Actually, there's a couple of things I wanted to mention. It's been a while for you. But like, as somebody that has had a dog in the past, does this hit more than it did in childhood in some places?
I would say so. Even with a cat.
Because there's...
This vicious motherfucker right here.
There's a few scenes that hit pretty hard. First off, even taking Beethoven out of the question, the scenes between, I can't... Alice?
Yeah.
Is Bonnie Hunt's name? I was like, I can know. The only reason I remember that is because of the scene where Duchovny calls her Alicia and she corrects him. I feel like that's the only time her name is said. But their relationship is like those scenes when they're on the back porch. It almost seem like they're a little repetitive because it's like every time something bad happens, we get a shot of them sitting on the back porch, like contemplating their life. But these...
It's like whenever the plot's wrapping up in Full House and the music plays and someone gives a speech.
But those scenes have progression because it starts off with him hating Beethoven. Then it's like, we're going to have to get rid of him. And then there's the whole thing of he's going to have to be put down because he attacked Dr. Varnick. And then there's the aftermath of that where he's like, did I do the right thing? I love her answer to that, by the way. In any other lazy script, it would have been like, this is the clear-cut answer. I kind of love that he says, did I do the right thing? If I remember correctly, doesn't she just say, I don't know? And it's like, I love the honesty in that.
And then she breaks it down even further. She's like, if you did it for safety, that's one thing, but if you did it just because you hate the dog, that's something else entirely.
And then there's another layer on top of that one, where it's like, do we believe a guy we've met twice, or do we believe our own child? And it's like, there's a lot of depth in there in these conversations. And the whole idea of, like, the fact that he's has to choose between his... Because the rest of the plot with Dean Jones is so intense, it almost seems like an afterthought when we have that whole thing about choosing between his family and his dream. It's like its own conflict at the start. And then by the end, it's like the dream is not even a factor. It's like life or death. So that's the insanity of this movie. But then, let's talk about the other scenes that hit really, really hard. That scene where he's taking Beethoven to be put down. What's really great about the way this is handled is that in another movie they might say, like, well, we know that's not going to be the outcome, and we know it's a movie for families, so we don't want to get too serious, despite having a plot like this. But even though we know, going in, it's a kids' movie, and Beethoven's not going to be executed in this movie, they play the scene where he's driving him to the vet to be put down as if that's exactly what's going to happen. They play it with that much seriousness. And downplayed seriousness. It's not like all sad music and all that stuff. It's him having a real serious conversation with him, like, my dad had to do this and now I'm in this position.
It really opens up why he didn't want a dog in the first place, because he's had his heart broken before.
Yeah. And it's
like he's using all the other excuses as like a scapegoat.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, and also the way he tells that story and tells her, it makes you wonder, like, does Alice even know that happened to him?
Yeah, because she doesn't really act like she would know that throughout it. No. And almost like she would understand when he said he didn't want one. Despite the fact that there's that weird thing where, like, everybody assume when Beethoven walks in and they assume he's a new dog, everybody, including her, assumes George did that unannounced. Yeah, so to me, all of that adds up to, I think the movie might be legit good. Like, so much of it is actually really well handled. And they take a dark-ass plot, and they play that plot pretty seriously. And they play the emotion very seriously. And they give a reason. Every kid gets a specific reason to be really attached to him. And you really get that sense of, it's not just a case of Beethoven feels like part of the family because they tell us that. We watch it happen. We even get little clips, like when they're playing in the sprinklers with him in the background of a scene. Makes the family feel lived in with Beethoven in it. And that's pretty well done for a movie like this that would just be considered a throwaway family movie about a dog again. Because there's a billion of those. Bonnie
Hunt even has the line after they think that he's been put down where she says that Beethoven made it feel like a real home.
Yeah. That takes us down a whole rabbit hole that they don't even completely go down, but it's like, she's basically saying, like, because of you and your dream, your fucking nose company, your freshener company, we're like a dying family, basically. And it's, and yeah, the fact that it's able to play that seriously, but I think it's because it's talking about really serious shit, but never really goes over dramatic about it. Especially for the kind of movie it is. I think the way the score is so minimal helps that. Like, it's kind of crazy for me like this how minimal the score is.
And the problems in the movie that the family faces are all pretty realistic.
Yeah.
Like, it's not done over the top or too much like After School Special.
Yeah, it's just young love, getting bullied, near-death experience. We all had that moment when we were like Emily's age where we did something really dangerous when nobody was around, right?
In my case, almost drowned also.
Yeah. So, is that the first movie? In a nutshell? So. Yeah. Like I said, it's got the slapstick in there. It's got Ted driving through the building. It's got Tucci and Oliver Platt doing it. It's got Tucci's high-pitched scream, which is still hilarious to this day. I find it just as funny as I did at the age of like 5.
It's got Duchovny and Heaton being dragged all through the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a pretty over-the-top scene. And yet, that's the crazy thing. That's how good the emotional scenes are. It's after a scene that over the top that we have an emotional scene like your family's going down the drain and you're worried about a dream. But yet there should feel like a clash is there. But maybe we're too familiar with the movie. Like, maybe if we were seeing the movie for the first time tonight, that would be like, whoa, that was a total change. But I guess I've seen it, but I don't see the tone shifts now. I just see a movie that does one thing well, and then does a totally different thing also well. like I said, that could just be familiarity. It totally could be.
Mm-hmm.
But am I making sense?
Yeah.
All right. You want to go into the second one?
Sure.
Okay. Remember how we were saying that the first one, like the most over the top they get, besides maybe Ted driving through the building, is the big company heating scene.
Mm-hmm.
I think the second one jumps the shark a couple of times, at least.
Mm-hmm.
In a shorter amount of time. So we're coming in 2 years later. The first one was 91, this one's 93.
Mm-hmm.
And we're already starting, we're going, like, the whole idea, the whole thing about you imagine producers going into a sequel and they're like, it's a sequel, we gotta go bigger. Everything's gotta be what the first one was, but bigger.
Mm-hmm.
So we immediately start with a dream sequence that ends with Charles Grodin holding a giant steak. So we get 2 dream sequences in this. At least I can remember. There might be more, but I remember 2 specific. It's bookended with dream sequences. That's what happens. So, and all those dogs that they took into the house, it's like they're, once again, another thing where it's like very 101 Dalmatians-esque, where all the stray dogs now live in the house. Apparently something happened to all of them. Hopefully it was just that they found owners. Not, maybe George got a little out of hand and got angry all over again. But no, we do establish that we're having the same problems with Beethoven, but we have a much more patient George now.
Which is funny, because even at the end of the first one, he's not all, like, super happy-go-lucky about the dog situation. Like, the reporter literally asks him, you know, are you a dog lover now? And his response is, more now than before.
That's one of those responses where only Charles Grodin could have delivered that like that. Because that pause was an eternity. So we have some new problems. Now instead of Ted being a bully magnet, he's just rejected. Like he's on the baseball field, and he doesn't just get picked last. They pick somebody that's not even on the field before they pick him. And because we're dealing with a kids movie in the early 90s, it's a girl, which it makes it even worse. Because it's not, but we'll get more into questionable things in a little bit when we get to Rice's part of the story. I do think it's funny. Later on, we're getting a montage. This movie is... We saw the time here. When the credits start rolling, it's been on for an hour and 24 minutes. Almost 50% of this movie feels like montages. But during one of these montages, I found it really funny that it's showing how tired they are because they have to hide the dogs from hide the puppies from their parents, and they're taking care of them in secret. So they're all like falling asleep in the middle of the day. And when we see Ted, there's a funny shot of him falling asleep standing out in the field, on the baseball field. It's like, it's hilarious to me that apparently when he's wide awake and ready to go, Ted can't get picked to save his life. But apparently on this particular day where he was falling asleep standing up, he apparently got picked. So, I don't know what maybe that one girl didn't show up or something. But, yeah, and then Rice has a new love life. Should we just go ahead and go into that?
Sure.
Okay, so there's a couple of things to bring up. First off, something that wasn't quite as much of a factor in 1993, or even relatively recently, but now in the span of like the last few years, things have changed. So the whole idea is that Rice is now in somewhat of a I don't know if you can call it a love triangle, because I don't think the two guys realize the other exists. But she's really attracted to Taylor, and Taylor's our kind of douchey looking dude. He looks like he would have been like one of DJ Tanner's boyfriends or something. But this guy is probably a date rapist. There's an actual scene in this actual movie for actual children where she goes to his house party, he takes her upstairs, he locks the door, and he says, "You're never going to forget this experience," when she is saying, "No, I want to leave now." And he has trapped her. And the good option, the other option, the good guy that she's going to end up with instead, I shit you not, is Danny Masterson. Talk about the fucking timing on that nowadays. So, that's not aged well. But let's go back to the house party. Let's talk about the scene that we just rewound and watched again about 50 times. Go ahead. This is your moment.
Well, you said that there were moments in this movie where the shark is jumped, and this is one of them. So you've got Beethoven at this party, because he was with Rice at the time that she got to the party, and they're pouring beer on him, and he gets to the point where he can't stand it anymore, and he runs and pulls the entire front of the house off into the lake, with people, partygoers falling in, furniture falling in, and then in the room where Taylor and Rice are, the wall comes off, and Taylor literally flies out the window into the lake. And it makes the scream from the beginning of Agro Monsters.
And when you watch this scene back 20 times over, you see something new every time.
Like, you see, like, when you go back and look, Rice has not left her spot, so she made no attempt to help him and keep him from falling.
And seemed to have no reaction to the destruction. There's where you get the whole shot of the house, and by the way, A+ continuity on this. There's one particular shot where you can see the house tearing away, and way in the bottom left corner, you can still see Beethoven running out of the frame. But then we notice the continuity of the wall, like, falling off is, like, way off. But on Beethoven, it was spectacular. Then there was the whole idea of this amazing stunt double, who by the way whose face is perfectly hidden. We watched it in slow-mo about 10 times. The face of the stunt double is never revealed. And then but it's still kind of this perfect dive, because that's the thing, is he doesn't really fall out of the opening. It's like a launch. It's like it's a full-on stunt. It's like this was his last attempt to seduce Rice. It was this acrobatic stunt.
It's like Studer from Mad TV. Look what I can do.
And then there was your theory. She straight up doesn't even try to hide that Beethoven did this. She looks down and she says, "Thanks, Beethoven, for this." All the evidence is probably there. And he's looking up at her, by the way, before he gets potentially drowned. By the way, nice unintentional callback of immediately cutting to Emily after Taylor's potential drowning, to remind us of what almost happened to her. What her alternate universe without Beethoven is. Your question was, are the Newtons financially responsible for that damage?
They can't afford it if they are.
Yeah. And as I was saying, Taylor absolutely looks like an I'm pressing charges kind of guy. Despite the fact that there's so many charges that would have been pressed against him before the night was over. Or could have been. He looks like he's got rich... I mean, we're under the assumption he's got rich parents, right? Doesn't he have like a really nice car and everything? And he's got that whole spot to party in the middle of fucking nowhere. Yeah, that's a whole thing we never went into that might be a big problem for them later. Because it's really, I mean, really, after all that whole thing, is he going to just kind of sit there in the water? Unless he drowned. We never see him again. Last time we see him, he's getting a bit overpowered by the crowd there. Maybe he's just out to sea now. But
somewhere, I'm sure there's a deleted scene of Charles Grodin opening this letter, where he's being like summoned to small claims court.
And he does like a Peter McAllister scream.
And then to gloat, Taylor takes the three-dimensional nose that's the logo for his air freshener company, and, like, attaches it to the hood of his car and drives around with it.
it's I mentioned a Peter McAllister scream. I don't want to take away from George Newton having his own scream. I love the moment when he has the showdown with the paperboy in this one. And then he screams Bonnie Hunt's name, and that's the last we hear about that. We hear that from a different room, and that's the last time we address that scene. We go back into the whole thing that's now kind of also been its own trope. The idea of kids hiding something from parents for a long period of time, usually animals. We're in like Dustin checks in territory. Even though this was the year before that. Well, don't ask me why. I just know off the top of my head the year Dustin Jackson came out. That's just a thing. But so new set of villains. Not as threatening as Dean Jones by any means, but I mean we do have. I compared Tucci and Oliver Platt to Jasper and Horace. I talked about how the ending where they have all the dogs is like the end of 101 Dalmatians. Now we have Debbie Mazar come in, who I think may have been intentionally modeled after the evil queen in Snow White. She's even wearing red like the apple. And she says the puppies are born, and Jeff Corey's there. And he's like, well, what do you want me to do with these puppies? And she says, do whatever you want to do. Drown them. That's a literal Cruella de Vil quote. It's like, there's no way that was an accident. So there's 101 Dalmatians is all over these two movies. Intentionally or unintentionally. I'm leaning towards intentionally. But I don't know if that's ever been confirmed. But what do you think of them as villains? Both standalone and compared to... I guess they're more comparable to Oliver Platt and Tucci than Dean Jones, because they're both kind of bumbling. I mean, she tries to be the serious one with Chris Penn being the dumb one, but they're... Yeah. I mean, it's really more just her barking orders, and it's him that's stuck with doing, like, the dirty work. But how do you feel about them as villains overall?
I mean, I agree with you. I think they're much less threatening.
Which is really interesting, since we were talking about the whole formula is sequels need to go bigger. Which this movie certainly tries to do. Whether it be with the antics, or with the locations, or whatever.
I think it does still try, where since it's Beethoven's kids that are in danger, it's the stakes are more personal.
Yeah. And I mean, there is the whole scene where this is kind of funny, because this movie's established as such a tone to where it feels kind of lighter. It's the scene where Chris Penn goes at him with a stick, and he actually jabs him in the gut with it, and they're on like a cliffside. And I was like, oh man, this is getting really intense. In that moment, just totally forgot Dean Jones pulled a gun on him. It's like, oh no, he's been in significantly more dangerous situations. He even jumped through the skylight in that scene. This is nothing to him. It's like when he's charging up the mountain, he was thinking back to like, Dean Jones pulled a gun on me, I jumped through a skylight. This is like walking up a mountain to deal with Chris Penn in full bumbling mode is, well, we were reading in the trivia, apparently he was having a real bad drug problem while making this movie. But it does kind of go full Baby's Day Out in some cases. That's full, when I think full Baby's Day Out, you know which scene in Beethoven's Second I'm talking about. When he falls into the stump. That is... Well, I told you while we were watching it, I felt like the first real jumping the shark moment in this movie was when George is dancing around to Do You Love Me, I think the song is the song from Dirty Dancing. And we get a shot of Beethoven covering his eyes like this. Like, of all the things that have happened in these two movies, that's where that's where I was like, I think we've jumped the shark. And then we get Chris Penn falling into the stump. You mentioned that it looks like the turkey in Friends when he's walking around. And it's it reminds me of something that would have happened to Brian Haley in Baby's Day Out. Then there's like the stuff with like the eating contest, which is clearly in there for no reason. It's like because it felt like a big moment, I guess, like a big comedy moment or something. Maury Chaykin is there. And we have scenes like that are trying to go the gross out route where Rice decides to touch the shit to see if they're near or far. First off, they haven't been chasing them for very long because they can't be that far away. And secondly, it's like the whole idea is to see, are they close?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like the whole time they stop to have this dialogue of somebody's gonna touch the shit, and it's like, oh, that's gross, but it's like, oh, don't worry, I'll do it. George says like, what? This is all pausing while they get farther away.
Mm-hmm.
This is strictly for, we're making, you know, a family comedy. We have to have a gross out scene involving dog shit because we're in the sequel now.
Mm-hmm.
Running out of ideas and all that. So.
And also George being surprisingly okay with that being the course of action.
Yeah. And then we get some stuff thrown in there just because the movie's credits start rolling at an hour 24.
Mm-hmm.
We need filler. So even though Ted has his own problems that are addressed throughout the movie, sorry, he runs into a bully again.
Yeah.
Just the very last minute. He meets Catherine Reitman.
Mm-hmm.
They might have a thing, and then this guy that looks like Corey Haim in his adult years comes in.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very 1993 bully. He's the kind of guy that says something and then says not unironically,
Mm-hmm.
which is a weird thing to hear these days because it's like, oh, forgot that was a thing almost.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just, and it's the same thing. Beethoven gets him out of it because he tells Beethoven to bite the kid in the dick. But that's, yeah, but then obviously once we get to the ending, it's just all going. We have the whole thing when they fall through the bridge. But I was telling you, it was like that just kind of feels like desperate slapstick at this point because it wasn't even done to them. It was just shit luck on their part that they fell through the bridge.
And then Chris Penn gets pissed on.
Yeah, we did get a couple of pissings in the first one. We got Olan Jones in the first scene of the first movie.
Mm-hmm.
I think his briefcase got pissed in a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we don't get much of the scenes that show how much their marriage has strengthened. Because I guess now that it's not in turmoil, it doesn't matter. We get that one brief scene when they're dancing on the dock. And it's like, we really see it from it's a distant scene. Like, it's not a scene that shows, like, oh, they're so in love. Like, we're seeing it from Bryce's perspective, really. Which I guess is, you know, something. Like, we're kind of seeing things more from the kid's perspective in this movie overall, anyway. Because it's like, they're kind of the main protagonists because they have to take care of the dogs in private. They have to deny George Monopoly. That scene always kind of bummed me out. Because he looked like he really wanted to play Monopoly with them. He really wanted to be I loved your theory of why he wanted to be the banker.
Because he loves money.
He's still obsessed with his
dream.
To be rich.
But it's also nice, though, too, because a lot of sequels rehash plot points. So it would have been easy to, like, show the family in crisis again, but the family gets along very well, and that's not threatened at all in this movie.
Yeah. And then there was the whole idea of just kind of George doing it, since we're doing this whole thing for Charles Grodin's sake. George just kind of gets these like one-off moments of being the dad that doesn't really know what he's doing. Like the scene where he tries to chop wood and he breaks the headlight on the car. There's the scene where Emily has to distract him, so she asks him where babies come from, and he gets pretty surprisingly detailed. Like, he gets pretty far. It's like, and the ruse is over before he has to really, like, go the distance in explaining this. But yeah, for the most part, the parents kind of get shortchanged in this one, and it focuses more on the kids. But like we were saying, I guess it shakes it up a little bit. It doesn't feel too much like some of the jokes feel rehashed, and like I said, there's a lot of montages. Like we get kind of the main. There's like really just that one main montage in the first movie. But we get like 3 of those in this. But yeah. And last but not least, speaking of the montages, Beethoven's Second has an Oscar nomination for a song that repeats 3 times if you include the end credits. So that's you can throw that out. Yeah. So Beethoven taking his date to a movie and bringing her popcorn. Because the whole idea, the way the song category works, is the Academy members that vote watch the scene and listen to the song in the context of the scene.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it also was released close to Christmas, which probably helped.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got Beethoven Eyes going on right now,
Mm-hmm.
which means that I think we've reached the end. So was there really anything else to add?
Go watch the scene of Taylor flipping out the house.
Many times over.
There's also a secret little scene that's really fun, where Debbie Mazar and Chris Penn are running up a hill, and she runs through a tree, and it comes back and slaps him in the face. Pause your player, whatever it is, right when she's running out of frame and Chris Penn is coming up. It's such a determined look. Like, it's the same look he had when driving to the warehouse in Reservoir Dogs to figure out what happened.
I was going to say, it's the same look with that. It's the same look when he finds Mr. Blonde dead, and it's the same look when he pulls the gun on Larry.
Mm-hmm. It's his Chris Penn determined look. But breaking them down, the two separately, the first one is definitely the more superior film, but there is some fun you can have with the second one. If you're in the mood for it.
Is what, like, you can like kind of roll your eyes and say, "Oh, this is kind of really dated" when it's jumping the shark.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in the right mood, the moments where it jumps the shark is what you're here for.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, and it's funny because we pointed out too that when they first get the puppies, they talk about calling the vet, and it's like you'd think they'd be scarred from their vet being Dr. Varnick for one session.
Yeah, because that was probably Dr. Varney was probably their only interaction with a vet up to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about the fact that the second one seems to jump the shark, and that's going on the fact also that this movie has multiple straight-to-video sequels that I've seen, but I don't really remember. But I can only imagine they are significantly worse when it comes to jumping the shark, if I had to guess. So, yeah, like I said, there's going to be a whole bunch of videos kind of at once here. Like I said, I'm just probably going to talk about Midnight Run by itself to continue this Grodin thing. Yeah, any last comments on Grodin, I guess, is where we should end this.
Not that I can think of. I mean, he was good at what he did. And
Great
he
at
was,
what he did.
yeah. And especially he was great at being pissed off.
And kind of being... There's a number of people that are comparable in regards to people that could play the straight man, but in such, like, still a big comedic way. Like, it's also easy to see that, imagine that Steve Martin was considered for this. But much like Steve Martin, you can't really imitate Charles Grodin. Like, you can definitely recognize his humor, but if you try to imitate it, it's just, that's all, you're never gonna get anywhere other than a cheap imitation, because you're not gonna be able to reach that height in that specific style and delivery and everything else. So, alright, so does that wrap this up?
I would say so.
Alright, so until whatever the next thing is, I think that's going to be it for this.